about new legislation resulting from the election of Donald Trump, the Republican House and Senate, and what the heck they're all going to do about health care and tax law. Lester Perling and I are here. Dr. Singh is going to try to call in. He's having some technical issues of his own. And Lester, do you want to control the slides and take us through the first part of this?
I can for the first couple, Alan. I don't see it on the screen, so I'm just going to talk, and you can kind of move the slides, I guess, because I'm not really going to follow them that much. So I'm going to start with a little bit about what we can perhaps expect on the healthcare front, which the word perhaps should be in all caps, italicized, bold, and anything else you can think of, because it's anybody's guess. Clearly this is a case of, for the Republican Party, be careful what you ask for or you may get it. They had, I don't think they were expecting to win this election. They had been complaining about the Affordable Care Act, for years, trying to block it, more so because of political expediency, I think, than anything else. Well aware they weren't going to be able to repeal or block it in the last Congress. So now they're in control, and I think it's pretty much fair to say, and what I'm hearing all of the experts say, is that they really don't have a clue. There's a few old bills that are floating around. The potential incoming HHS secretary has one of those, but it looks like he's in big trouble now with some stock investment he made and then sponsored a bill, so who knows if we'll see him or not. President-elect Trump, of course, claims to have a plan, but I think we've seen what his claims end up being, so it's not at all clear where they may or may not go. Trump complicated matters a great deal a couple days ago in an interview with the Washington Post, in which he said that his plan will include everybody having health insurance, which I imagine threw the Republican Congress into a tailspin, because I don't think it had any intent of ensuring that everyone gets health insurance. And so that's going to create a huge potential rift between Trump and the Congress, if that's what Trump really meant. But that's, who knows if that is or it isn't. Another point of pressure on Congress would be a literally just released Congressional Budget Office report, where they looked at a Republican replacement bill a little while ago that was floating around, and said that if it were passed, 18 million Americans would immediately lose their insurance. Within 10 years, there'd be 32 million uninsured Americans, and premiums for existing health care policies would more than double within 10 years. So that's not good news for the Republicans. So what's going to happen is really not clear. I mean, there are some clear problems with the Affordable Care Act. One of the main ones, which Trump has actually recognized, is the inability of the insurance plans to sell across state lines because of the state regulation of the insurance industry. And so there's a big push, and even this may have been true even if the Democrats had won, to pass federal legislation to allow insurers to write policies across state lines. What's happening is, in some states, there's just too small a risk pool in these exchange plans, and for a number of reasons. One, a lot of the invincibles, as they're known, the folks who are in their 20s who would buy health insurance but never use it, ended up getting jobs as the economy improved, and so are now covered by their employers. And the pool of potential insureds got skewed and to a slightly older group, which causes more utilization. And that's true in about 5 or 6 states. So there's some clear things that policymakers recognize could be done to improve the Affordable Care Act. Whether it goes away or not and what replaces it, who knows. For now, it's still a law, and I suspect it probably will be for a little bit to come, but again, that's hard to predict. There's, I think, a few principles that are probably guiding the Republicans, and one of them, the first one of those, and there's 4 that some folks have recognized, is a need to reduce entitlement spending, which doesn't surprise anyone. So, there will be a continued push to reduce the amount of Medicare and Medicaid expenditures. The issue is going to be how they get there. House Speaker Ryan, as you may know, has advocated to some degree turning Medicare into a voucher system and letting Medicare eligible recipients go out into the free market and buy insurance with their vouchers. That's probably a problematic proposal, but something that's certainly on the table. He's also proposed just doing cuts to Medicare, increasing the eligibility age to 67. So there's a number of potential tweaks that could happen. There's a very strong potential for Medicaid to become a pure block grant program. The incoming administrator of CMS, a lady named Seema Verma, has been a big advocate of that just based on a state's population or perhaps population of Medicaid recipients, state would be given a pot of money by the feds and say, do what you want with it. You create your own policy, you create your own benefits. It's all yours, probably with a few strings. Another principle that seems to be guiding the Republicans is, as one would expect, more of a free market approach and let the consumer choose, and that sort of is reflected in Ryan's, talking about Medicare vouchers. Along with that, another sort of key element or key principle is more transparency related to cost and quality. We've seen that a little bit in Florida with the pressure that Governor Scott has put on hospitals with regard to pricing transparency, and it's likely something that will continue at the national level in some form or another. In terms of payment reforms, bundled payments, pay for value instead of fee for service, it's hard to say. Congress would like to get rid of the Medicare centers I just blocked the name, Centers for Medicare Medicaid Innovation, out of which flows the whole concept of ACOs and other bundled payment innovations, because they think it's too much power for CMS. We may see some of those things go by the wayside, but they have two choices. They either continue with payment reforms to reduce expenditures, or simply stick with fee-for-service and cut payments, which probably is going to be the more difficult of the two choices. So there's a lot of things on the table for Congress and our newly elected president to think about. None of them are easy. They all have a lot of political risk associated with them, and how they'll turn out is kind of anybody's guess, which makes it hard to prepare for. I think CMS will sort of continue, this is my own personal belief, on some of its payment innovations with regard to value-based payments, bundled payments, putting more risk on the provider, even at the physician level, because fee-for-service just hasn't worked. It reinforces or encourages the wrong behavior, which is higher utilization, and the only way to control that then is through stringent sort of enforcement audit policies, or just cutting payments, which obviously is not very popular amongst providers. Speaking of enforcement, there's been some speculation about what the Trump administration is going to do with the enforcement agenda of the Obama administration. And I've seen differing views. Again, nobody knows. I think, though, it's important to recognize that the increase in enforcement, both criminally and civilly, really got a very big head of steam during the Bush years. So I don't know that we'll see much change. And also on the civil side, the False Claims Act enforcement, which of course drives so much of this, is really controlled by the relators and how many claim cases they file and their increased tendency, if the government chooses not to intervene, to move the case forward. So even if the Bush administration, or excuse me, the Trump administration were to, let's say, cut back resources to DOJ to handle these cases because they're trying to be more business friendly, the relators can still push these cases on their own. And at the end of the day, the reality is that Congress has to face is that the False Claims Act has brought back into the Medicare Trust Fund a significant amount of money. It's certainly more than paid for itself, and that's something that it's not going to be easy for Congress to walk away from when expenditures are increasing on entitlements and there's pressure to reduce costs. This is not a cost reduction, but it does, I'm sure, put some chilling effect on providers, and I think that's evidenced by the increased use of compliance plans and providers trying to prevent these kind of cases. So I'm not too confident we'll see much of a change in the enforcement agenda, but that certainly also remains to be seen. So, Alan, that sort of concludes at least what I wanted to initially talk about.
Lester, is there any chance that we'll get legislation that will reduce the horrendous record keeping, the horrendous reporting, the horrendous electronic medical record responsibilities that doctors have had?
I kind of doubt it. I mean, a lot of that's driven by a number of factors. So there's no single piece of legislation that could do it. I mean, it's driven by payment reform and the need for documentation in order to support increased payments relative to value-based payments and other types of payment reforms. Some of those it's driven by the requirement to switch to electronic health records, which frankly makes sense from a policy perspective and eventually will smooth itself out. It overall will have the tendency to reduce the cost of care with better communication. Right now it's a problem because systems aren't interoperable. They don't talk to each other that well yet. So there's a lot of issues with it, but it's a policy that's probably well intended and could work once the kinks get worked out. Another issue is protecting against liability, not just professional liability for providers, but False Claims Act liability, which in large part is driven by documentation and what you're able to prove that you did or didn't do in order to be able to withstand either a false claims case or an audit. I don't think any of that is necessarily going to go away. There may be some tweaking of it, but it's probably an inherent part of the system. I mean, who knows? Congress could decide to become very physician-friendly and really alter some of those. The AMA hasn't been a strong lobbyist in the past. I don't know that they will be in the future either. So, whether those things will be a priority is hard to say. But if I had to guess, I would say there might be some tweaking, but there's no one fix that could make all that go away. So I really wouldn't expect to see it.
Okay. What about the appointees on the medical end? How do you feel about them?
I think the CMS administrator designee is probably not bad. She's got a lot of experience in Medicaid, which does need to be reformed. Whether block grants to the states is the right answer or not, I don't know. But she's actually, unlike a lot of appointees, she's at least very experienced. Representative Price, who's a retired orthopedic surgeon and strong opponent of the Affordable Care Act, doesn't have any real policy expertise in this area. He's an opponent of lots of things, but not necessarily someone who's, he did draft some sort of bill, which I'm not familiar with, to replace the Affordable Care Act. Theoretically, being a retired physician, he should be physician-friendly, which could, portend some reduction on physician pressure in terms of issues like documentation and whatnot. But to some degree, his hands will be tied by existing laws and policy needs that aren't going to go away with the new administration. And I think there's increasing scrutiny of his past, which at least some very recent news reports suggest may be putting his nomination in some jeopardy. So whether or not he will come out of this at the end of the process now is at least a little bit in doubt, but who knows, we'll see.
Right, right. And then any comments on this vaccine article from Medical Economics?
I'm not sure it's that significant. I think it reflects more than anything, sort of President-elect Trump's contrarian nature and the fact that while there's no science to support the anti-vaccine movement, somehow he's buying into it, which I think is just part of his, this is my personal opinion, his sort of attempt to appear somewhat populist without really looking at the science or the policies behind things. So I think this is just sort of, that's somewhat of a political maneuver, but more reflective of his personality than anything that's going to change in terms of policy. But again, who knows?
Okay, so I'll cover the tax end now. Thank you very much, Lester.
Sure.
Okay, on page 7 of the PowerPoint, and everybody should have received a PowerPoint. If you don't, if you let us know, we'll be glad to send it to you. Please feel free to share it. We're looking at 4 different tax law changes that really look like they're coming down the pike. A reduction in the income tax bracket, but loss of certain deductions. A reduction or elimination of the 3.8% net investment income tax, which is paid for or was to be paying for a lot of the Affordable Care Act. A reduction in the FICA taxes relating to the Medicare tax of 0.9%, and then possible elimination or reduction of the federal estate tax. We think it's going to be very difficult to make any permanent tax changes, but we will possibly have, under the Balanced Budget Act, laws that will say that these taxes will go down and then come back up in 10 years. As a lot of you are probably aware, under the Byrd Rule, also known as the Balanced Budget Act, unless you have 60 of the 100 senators agreeing on a budgetary change, it has to be revenue neutral, or it has to come back. And that's why the Bush tax cuts of 2001, which included elimination of the estate tax, basically came right back in 2011. And there's a good chance that that's what we are going to be facing. On the estate tax end, we know very, very little. There hasn't been anything said that I'm aware of since the election. The Trump plan was to repeal the estate tax, but to possibly tax capital gains on death the way the Canadians do. And the Republicans have the same type of idea. Most of our clients are not going to do any large gifts or any large transactions from an estate tax standpoint, although a lot of our clients are. They are going forward, especially if they have a situation where they may sell a business soon, something's going up in value quickly, someone's not in good health and would have an estate tax issue. You can set up an irrevocable trust, which we call on page 12 a reversible clone trust. Set it up, gift to it, and then have the ability to reverse it if the estate tax goes away, or to merge it into your already existing dynasty trust if the estate tax stays. And as we see President-elect Trump continue to quibble with fellow Republicans and continue to have a low approval rating, we think it's more and more likely that there will not be any meaningful reduction in federal estate tax, at least this year. Now, from a tax reform standpoint, it looks like there's a good chance that corporate income taxes will be reduced. As part of that, they may reduce the ability to write off interest on loans, especially if the loans were taken to buy equipment. They may also do away with something that was near and dear to Donald Trump's heart, and that was the ability to carry back the net operating loss. So clients who have net operating losses or who are contemplating taking on debt may want to think about what to do now before the new law passes. We may find that S corporation income will be taxed as low as 25%. It's right now at 39.6%. So having an S corporation is probably a good thing for most physicians and health businesses, I wouldn't do anything that would prevent the use of an S-Corp between now and when we know what's going to happen. We may find that wages are taxed much higher than S-Corp income, and that may just be a nice little loophole that comes about. As far as other individual income tax issues, we may be looking at a lower capital gains tax, so there will be clients who will not be selling assets they would otherwise sell, pending seeing what happens. And we may be looking at a much higher standard deduction, which would eliminate the need for millions of taxpayers to file tax returns in the first place, or at least to know anything about filing a return other than to file 1040 EZ. At one point, Donald Trump had said he would put H&R Block out of business, and he may certainly reduce their business. If your clients are charitably oriented, we'll be glad to send you a copy of the January 12, 2017 article by John Blotmacher and Kevin Matz on how the elimination of the annual exclusion deductions for charitable contributions is going to really reduce what taxpayers will be able to deduct in many charitable situations. I think it's also noteworthy just to let you know, if you're doing IRA planning, that there was in the fall a bill passed by the Senate Finance Committee unanimously. That means that the Democrats and Republicans were both on it, that will make it more difficult to take an IRA after you die and to stretch it out longer than 5 years, unless it's going to a surviving spouse, a disabled beneficiary, someone not more than 10 years younger than the decedent, or is less than $450,000 worth. So that's going to change what we tax lawyers call stretch trust planning, and we would certainly expect that to be seen. I will mention that there is no way to predict when tax legislation would become effective. Usually, tax legislation becomes effective on the day that it leaves the Senate Finance Committee. So once the Senate's Finance Committee votes to make that a proposed law that would then be voted on by the Senate and the House, that's when the law becomes effective. It's retroactive to that date. We think we're months away. It could be April or May before anything comes out. But there have been tax cuts in American history that date back to January 1st of the year they're passed, and there have been tax cuts in American history that don't start until January 1st of the next year. So clients should plan on paying as much or possibly even more in taxes than they did last year based upon the same circumstances, because there will be nuances in this new law which will cause some people to pay more tax. You can remember the Reagan era where he lowered the income tax rates, but he took away the deductions, and a lot of people ended up paying more in income tax. So be conservative with your money management, and we will hope for the best. Lester, anything to add to that?
No, I'm disappointed to hear I won't be necessarily getting a tax cut, but it sounds like things are as uncertain in that area as in the healthcare arena, so everybody just really has to sit tight and watch closely and hope for the best.
Right, exactly. Everybody just needs to be flexible and ready to respond. And hopefully most of us will get a tax cut, but I wouldn't want anyone to say they saw this webinar and spent more money than they needed to and then didn't have enough to pay their taxes.
I was on Amazon while you were talking. I was just about to click buy and I stopped myself. So.
Maybe you were going to buy our book on healthcare law, then I would go ahead and make that purchase.
There you go.
All right, well, thank you very much, everyone, for attending. We will reschedule and have another one of these as soon as we know more about what's happening or more about what's not happening. May the rest of your day be billable. Thanks again, Lester.